So I had this comment from OG Barlos on one of my recent videos, and I sort of realised that I've never really broken down how I approach bass lines in lo-fi tracks in any great detail. So in this video I'm going to try and demystify it a bit and talk about how I record my bass guitar, what other software and VSTs I use for bass. I'll also talk a little bit about some theory and how I approach it from that side of things. And then finally, sort of effects and mixing tools I use for bass lines to get them super clean without losing any of the warmth and character. So to kick things off, I'm just going to go into how I record my bass guitar. So kicking off with my usual go-to instrument for bass for lo-fi beats, and it's just my bass guitar. So this one is a Fender Player Series, so it's the Mexican Fender P-Bass. So P-Bass is just the pickup configuration. They also had a jazz bass before this, which I think was a Squire, and honestly they both sounded pretty great, at least in the context of lo-fi beats. You don't have to go crazy on the bass guitar if you're not big into your bass playing. So yeah, I usually find it the easiest thing for me is personally to pick up a bass guitar and layer it in that way. And generally with my bass guitar, I'm going DI into my audio interface, which just means that I'm plugging it straight into the interface, into the same jack as you would if you're recording guitar direct. And the sound that you get initially is something like this. So it sounds pretty good, to be fair. Usually what I'm doing is I'm rolling off some of the highs. So if I got it right up, you can roll off with the guitar. And for lo-fi, I'm just looking for that warm sort of subby to low end bass. I'm not usually using it as a main sort of feature. Sometimes I do, but often my go-to is just the soft, warm sound. And then on top of that, I'm throwing on an archetype Corey Wong, which is quite a popular guitar plugin that emulates amps and cabs, as well as some additional effects. But all I usually do is go straight for the factory Corey Wong bass tones, and I go for the J bass or the P bass preset. So it adds a little bit more saturation and distortion. Just gives it a little bit more flavor. But that is it generally for me in terms of processing. And what I would say as far as the bass guitar is concerned is that even if you're not a guitar player or you've never picked up a bass guitar, I would highly recommend trying to find a cheap bass. It can really add a nice character to your track, and it can be a lot more organic and natural sounding than, say, a really electronic sub sound. Usually I'm just playing with my thumb rather than a pick. Just gives it a less sort of a tacky, sharp sound, more of a soft, round sound. So yeah, that's what I generally go for. And also, while I've got the bass guitar, I'm just going to talk about theory real quick. So generally with lo-fi beats, when I'm recording guitar or piano, more often than not, what I'm doing is I'm playing a major or minor triad, or maybe a major or minor 7th or 9th chord. And for that, unless you're playing some inversions, which I'll mention in a second, generally the root note is going to be the 1, and you can play that on the E string. So usually when I'm making a beat and I'm jamming over it and I'm layering in some bass, we'll just find the root note on the E string and we'll just play along to the chords. And then also with major and minor chords, it's the 3rd that changes and the 5th always stays the same. So what I mean by that is if we're playing an A minor chord and we want to play the bass line over it, you can play the A, the root note on the E string. You can also play the E on the A string. And then if it goes to a G, that's something you'll hear me do a lot, playing the 5th. But if it was an A major, the root note and the 5th is exactly the same. It's the 3rd that changes. What that means is usually if you're playing the root note, you can also play the 5th. And you can incorporate that in. So that's something you'll see me do a lot. And then often if I want to jazz it up a bit, we'll find out what the key of the track is, and then we'll work around the pentatonic scale. So if you're a guitar player, you'll know that it's exactly the same. Obviously you've not got the B and the E string, but it's the same. So if it's A minor, they're your notes. So you could play 1st, 5th, little run in the pentatonic, move to the next chord, back to pentatonic. So yeah, that's generally what you can think about when you're trying to approach bass lines in lo-fi. And now I'm going to talk about some VSTs that I like to use if I'm not using the guitar, and then I'll finish off with some mixing tips. So onto the VSTs. So I'm just going to break down a few of my favorite go-to choices that I think work really well in the lo-fi setting. The first one being one that I've mentioned in a few recent videos, and it's the Spitfire North 7 vintage keys. So it's effectively a vintage Rhodes and different vintage electronic pianos, and they've got some great bass sounds. So this is the all-round bass basic, and it's just a nice, soft, organic feeling bass, unlike some of the sub bass presets that you might get in your DAW, which can often sound a little bit electronic and harsh. This has just got a nice well-rounded, electronic, subby feel to it. So that's the all-round basic. And yeah, it's just an all-round nice bass sound. There's some nice presets in there as well. I picked this up really cheap actually on one of their sales. I think I paid about $20 for it with some other stuff. So yeah, you can get them cheap. So that's the first one I wanted to mention, which I'm using quite a bit at the moment. Next up is the Native Instruments Scarborough Rickenbacker bass. If you've got any of the Native Instruments bundles, complete 10, 11, whatever it's on now, they usually come with a couple of basses and they sound pretty good. So this is one I've used a few times. So there's a lot you can adjust on this. You can change the pickup, and if you click on the guitar, you can change the sort of tone roll off like I did with my bass. You've got amp settings that you can change. You can have it DI or through an amp. So yeah, it's a really nice sounding plugin. It sounds great if you sort of want that punchy sort of high end as well. And if you've not got a guitar and you're not interested in getting a guitar, you can get some great bass sounds without it. So this is another one I'd recommend. All sorts of things you can tweak and change. Generally for me, keep it low, cutting the high end, keeping that subby. So yeah, another one I recommend that I feel like a lot of people have got if they've ventured into any of the Native Instruments side of things with the bundles. You might have a nice sounding bass within that. Another honorable mention here, which I've not actually got, which I've heard a lot of people use in lo-fi, is the Trillion bass from Omnisphere. It's the Trillion bass, which is by the creators of Omnisphere and Keyscapes. I've used it before in the past and it does sound amazing, but as I said earlier, I've just not had the need for new bass sounds of late. But that's another thing to check out if you're looking for a sort of bundle of different guitar sounds. So yeah. So next up is a freebie that I did mention in the Spitfire Audio Labs video that I did a little while back, and it's the bass guitar from Spitfire Audio. So it's a free plugin. It's not got the adjustability or the sort of punchiness of the Native Instruments plugin, but it is a nice sort of warm bass guitar. But if you're looking for a sort of natural sounding bass and you don't want to spend any money just yet, then this is definitely worth checking out. If you want to hear it in action, you can check out my video that I did making a beat with Spitfire Labs plugins. But yeah, worth checking out, worth having in the arsenal as it's a freebie. I'm always loving the Labs stuff, so I do tend to use them quite a bit. So lastly, I just wanted to talk about some effects that I like to use and how I like to mix bass. So generally I'm keeping it simple. I like to make sure that everything below a certain frequency is mono, if not the whole bass line is mono. I've heard some people send tracks into me in the past for Spotify playlisting that I've just got some, you know, panning effects on the bass, and it's just a little bit distracting at times. If you've got the bass sort of heavily moving from left to right pan, it can make it sort of, it can be really noticeable and detract away from the listening experience. And also mix wise, it can just make it sound super muddy. So first thing I like to do is make sure I've got it mono. You can do that with utility, with the mono preset, or you can do it with EQ8, or you can do it with external VSTs, or you can just literally bounce it to a single mono track. I'm not saying that you can never have bass in stereo, but generally, as a rule of thumb, you want to keep it mono. And the next up, I often like to add saturation to the bass. Saturation is sort of like a combination of compression and distortion that adds sort of harmonic character to a track. So at the moment, I like to use the Sketch Cassette saturation, which is this over here. So if I play a loop from my last pack, it just sort of distorts it in quite a nice, subtle way, especially this version. And you can also use the age preset to cut off some of the highs, which is nice with the Sketch Cassette. Just make sure you don't add any wow or flutter to the bass, because that'll be a little bit annoying. And then, as always, often I just throw on an auto filter if I want the bass to be quite subby, or if I've got some annoying sort of fret noise or whatever it might be, even recording the bass DI, then I can just throw on an auto filter and keep the frequencies that I want. So it might just be that warm subby bass, which is often the case for me in my lo-fi beats. Next, finally, I like to mention RBass, which is something that I've been using more recently. This is a plugin from Waves, and it's effectively designed to make your bass more noticeable in different speakers. So if you're listening to it through monitors or headphones, often the track can sound great. But when it comes to speakers, phones, laptops, etc., it can just sort of not have enough bass to it, or it can be completely lost as it's not got the quality to pick up on the low end of the bass. So what this does is it takes the sort of desired frequency that you can adjust here and adds harmonics on top of that frequency to make it more noticeable through different speakers. So it's some waves, sort of magic, and you can adjust this here to see where you want to focus. So you can go right down to the subs, or you can keep it up here on the higher frequencies. And it just gives it that little bit more sort of bite, I guess, for when you're listening to it on mobile or laptop speakers, which has become quite an essential mixing tool for me in recent times. And then finally, as a lot of people know, when it comes to bass, it's great to have a sidechain of some sort on there. So in its most simple form, you can have a sidechain compression, which is effectively taking the bass and ducking it away for a certain element, typically the kick. What this does is it creates space for the kick in the mix without it clashing with the bass too much, as a sort of similar frequencies. So if I take the glue compressor from Ableton, press this little side thing here, I can turn on sidechaining, get the input to the kick, and then if I play the kick at the same time, what you've got to do is either increase the gain until you see this start to move, or you can reduce the threshold. So if I change the threshold a bit, you can hear that the bass is subtly ducking away for the kick. And I do want to keep this subtle because often I hear this used a bit too aggressively. When it comes to lo-fi beats, it's there as a mixing tool, in my opinion, more so than sort of a sound effect. In sort of more upbeat music, it can be used as a sort of feature of a track. It gives it a sort of pumping sound, but often I'm using it purely as a mixing tool to allow space for the kick. So you can see here there are various things that you can adjust. Generally, you're just going to want to look at attack, release, and ratio. So attack is how fast the compression kicks in, release is how long it lasts before it drops back down to normal volume, and then ratio is how much it's compressed by. You can also change the makeup gain as well, which is basically as it reduces the volume to make place for the kick, it can make the overall sound of the bass a little bit quieter, so you can increase that as well if you want to. So yeah, as I say, I'm just trying to add warmth and character without making it too muddy. One last honourable mention would be if I'm recording a DI bass or through an amp, electric guitar bass, I would often drop soothe on there just to get rid of some of the resonant frequencies if it is a little bit too muddy and resonant. Or you can do that with EQing and that sort of thing as well. So yeah, that about sums it for this week's video. I hope the content was helpful. Please do let me know in the comments down below if there's anything you want me to explain in more detail, or if there's a particular video topic that you want me to cover in the future. But yeah, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you next week.